My name is Camille Serrano, and for the first 15 years of my adult life, I existed as a ghost. Not a vengeful one, but a quiet one, the kind that moves through rooms without stirring the air, the kind that learns to live in the spaces others forget to look. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house painted the color of buttercream, with a wide, sweeping porch and columns that spoke of old money and older secrets. Our family name, Serrano, was a currency in that city. My father, Arthur Serrano, was a retired judge, a man whose presence filled every room with the unyielding weight of his principles. My mother, Eleanor, was a beautiful, fragile woman who arranged flowers and managed the household with a quiet grace that was really a form of surrender. And then there was my sister, Genevieve, 2 years my senior. She was the sun around which our family orbited, brilliant, ambitious, destined for the law, for greatness, for everything I was not. I was the quiet one, the keeper of sketchbooks filled with charcoal drawings of twisted live oaks and the weathered faces of strangers. I read poetry and philosophy, finding more solace in the words of Rilke than in the polite, stilted conversations at our Sunday dinners. They saw my quietness as a failing, my artistic soul as an indulgence. They didn't understand me, and I had long ago stopped trying to make them. At 22, I graduated with a degree in art history and literature, a path they considered a beautiful, pointless detour. The storm that broke my world began not with a thunderclap, but with the silent, insidious glow of a computer screen. A private, intimate video, filmed by a boy I had loved and trusted during a spring break trip, was stolen from his laptop and posted online. It spread through the small, interconnected circles of Charleston society like a poison. I was no longer Camille Serrano, the judge's younger daughter. I was a spectacle, a whisper, a stain. Genevieve found it first. I learned later that she didn't call me. She didn't offer a word of comfort or sisterly protection. She sent the link to our father with a single, chilling message: "You need to handle this before it tarnishes the family." Her concern wasn't for my violation, but for the collateral damage to her own assent. That night, the air in our buttercream house turned to ice. My father summoned me to his study, the room where he doled out praise and punishment my entire life. The video was playing on his monitor, a silent, flickering nightmare. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You have brought shame to this house. To our name." "I didn't do anything, Papa," I whispered, my voice choked with tears I refused to let fall. "This was done to me. I was violated." "You violated the Serrano name," he thundered, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "You think we raised you to be seen like common trash?" I looked past him, searching for my mother. She stood in the doorway, her hand clutching a small, gold cross at her throat, her eyes fixed on the floor. She wouldn't look at me. I turned to Genevieve, who stood beside her, her expression unreadable, her posture perfect. There was no pity in her eyes, only a distant, clinical assessment of a problem being solved. My father's next words were swift and final. "You want to live without decency? Then you'll do it without my name, without my roof, and without my money." I packed a single suitcase in a haze of disbelief. My sketchbooks, my journals, a few changes of clothes. As I walked through the living room, my father placed my debit card on the grand piano, its polished surface reflecting my pale, stricken face. "Don't call," he said. "Don't write. You are no longer our concern." My mother watched from behind the lace curtains of the front window as I stepped off the porch and into the humid Charleston night. She didn't wave. She didn't move. The door clicked shut behind me, and in that sound, I heard the final, definitive end of my childhood. I spent the first few nights in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind with flickering neon signs and sheets that smelled of bleach and regret. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. On the third day, I bought a one-way bus ticket to a place I'd only ever seen on a map, Denver, Colorado. It seemed far enough, cold enough, to freeze the memory of the Carolina heat and the burning humiliation. The bus journey was a long, rattling passage through landscapes and lives I didn't belong to. Somewhere in the vast, empty plains of Kansas, under a sky bruised with twilight, I took out a small, leather-bound journal my mother had given me for my 16th birthday. It was filled with family birthdays, her recipe for shrimp and grits, and small, pressed flowers from our garden. One by one, I tore out the pages. I didn't burn them. That felt too dramatic, too final. I let each piece go out the window, watching them flutter and dance in the wind until they were consumed by the darkness behind me. It was a quiet letting go, a release of everything that had once defined me. As I saw my reflection in the grimy window, a tired, hollowed-out girl with haunted eyes, I made a silent promise. I would not be erased. I would simply become someone else. Someone they would never find, and more importantly, someone they could never hurt again. Denver met me with a biting, indifferent cold that seeped through my thin coat and settled deep in my bones. The city was a sprawling grid of gray and white, the mountains a distant, jagged promise of something grander that felt impossibly out of reach. My first home was a room in a shared house in a neighborhood where the paint was peeling and the sirens were a nightly lullaby. The room was barely larger than a closet, containing a lumpy mattress on the floor, a wobbly folding table, and a small, cracked window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was bleak, but it was mine. It was anonymous. I took on the name Leah. Just Leah. When forms required a last name, I wrote gray. It felt fitting, a color that was neither black nor white, a shade that could blend into any background. Camille Serrano, the girl who loved art and poetry, was buried. Leah Gray, the girl who survived, was born. My days became a blur of relentless work. Mornings were spent at a bustling downtown cafe, my hands raw from hot water and cleaning solutions as I bussed tables and refilled coffee cups, my mind a blank slate memorizing orders. Afternoons, I worked as a cleaner at a small community health clinic, the scent of antiseptic clinging to my clothes long after I'd clocked out. I scrubbed floors sticky with spilled juice and mopped up the quiet despair of waiting rooms, invisible to the doctors and patients who hurried past me. At night, I did data entry from my tiny room, the rhythmic click of the keyboard the only sound in my solitary world. I didn't have friends. I didn't speak of my past. I built a fortress of silence around myself, brick by painstaking brick. The pain of my family's betrayal was a constant, low-grade fever, but I learned to function with it. I learned to numb it with exhaustion. But the part of me that was Camille, the part that saw the world in shades of light and shadow, hadn't died. It had just gone dormant. One night, after a particularly grueling week, I couldn't sleep. The silence of my room felt heavier than usual. I took a piece of cardboard from a discarded box and, using the dregs of coffee from my thermos and a cheap charcoal pencil, I drew. I drew a woman's figure, her back to the viewer, standing at the edge of a cliff, her form almost dissolving into the vast, empty sky. I didn't hang it on the wall. I slid it under my mattress, a secret I kept even from myself. The shift began on a frigid Tuesday night at the clinic. I was emptying the trash in the reception area when I heard a raised voice from one of the consultation rooms. A young mother, her face etched with terror, was clutching a crying toddler. An immigration officer, impatient and domineering, was shoving a form at her, his voice sharp. "Sign it," he demanded in English. "It's a standard voluntary departure. You sign or we take you now." The woman was shaking her head, whispering in Spanish, "No entiendo. Por favor, mi hijo." Something inside me, a long-dormant instinct for justice that my father had preached but never practiced, snapped into place. Before I could think, I stepped forward. "She's not signing anything," I said, my voice quiet but firm. The officer turned, his eyes dismissing me in an instant. "The cleaner. The ghost. This doesn't concern you," he grumbled. "She's in a medical facility. She has a right to counsel. You can't coerce her into signing away her rights," I said, the words coming from a place I didn't know I still had. I had spent a few sleepless nights reading about immigration law online, a strange form of penance for my own privileged past. He was taken aback, not by the legal argument, but by the fact that I had made it. He scowled, muttered a threat about reporting the clinic, and stormed out. The young mother looked at me, her eyes flooded with a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical touch. She didn't know my name. She didn't need to. In that moment, I wasn't a ghost. I was a shield. The next day, I was called into the office of the clinic's director, a kind, weary man named Elias Vance. I expected to be fired. Instead, he looked at me with a curious, searching gaze. "The receptionist told me what you did," he said. That took courage. I didn't think about it, I replied honestly. That's when courage counts the most, he said with a small smile. I also run a small nonprofit, the Hearthstone Project. We provide legal aid and support for immigrants and refugees. We could use someone with your conviction. It wouldn't be cleaning floors. I started at the bottom, of course. Making coffee, filing paperwork, translating documents. But I was a sponge. I soaked up everything. I read case files at night, learning the intricate, often cruel, labyrinth of immigration law. I listened to Elias negotiate with lawyers and comfort families who had lost everything. I discovered I had a mind for policy, a knack for writing grant proposals that could move even the most hardened foundations. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't just about survival. It was about building. The Hearthstone Project became my sanctuary, my family, my home, though I never dared to use that word out loud. I was still Leah Gray, the quiet woman with no past, but my present was becoming rich and meaningful. One afternoon, after we had successfully secured asylum for a family fleeing political persecution, a young intern turned to me. "Why do you do this, Leah?" she asked. "You work harder than anyone I know." I looked out the window at the Denver skyline, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. "Because I know what it's like to be cast out," I said softly. "And I decided that if I couldn't go home, I would build one for others." In the quiet, tireless work of helping others find their footing, I was slowly, imperceptibly, finding my own. The ghost of Camille Serrano was beginning to feel the faint, stirring breath of life again, not as a memory of who she was, but as the foundation of who Leah was becoming. The years in Denver passed like seasons, each one adding another layer of strength and purpose to the life I was building. Leah Gray was no longer a name I hid behind. It was a name that carried weight in the hushed, important circles of advocacy and policymaking in Colorado. I had gone from an assistant at the Hearthstone Project to its executive director after Elias Vance retired. I sat on citywide task forces, my voice a calm, steady presence in rooms full of blustering politicians and cynical bureaucrats. I never raised it, but when I spoke, people listened. My power wasn't in volume, but in precision, in the unshakable foundation of work and results I had built. My apartment was no longer a closet-sized room, but a modest one-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, filled with books and plants. On one wall, there was a single, framed piece of art, the charcoal drawing of the woman on the cliff edge I had made all those years ago. It was a reminder of how far I had come. I still kept to myself, my past a locked room inside me, but the loneliness had transformed into a chosen solitude, a space where I could think, recharge, and strategize. The past rarely intruded. I never Googled my family. I never looked up news from Charleston. The wall I had built between my two lives was high and thick, and I intended to keep it that way. One of my closest colleagues, a fiery and brilliant lawyer named Marion, once gently prodded that wall. We were working late on a new legislative proposal to protect undocumented witnesses in criminal trials. "You know, Leah," she said, peering at me over her glasses, "for someone who fights so hard for people to be seen and heard, you keep yourself awfully hidden. No one here knows a thing about where you came from." I offered her a small, tired smile. "They know who I am now," I said. "That's what matters." "Is it?" she pressed, her voice soft. "Or are you still running from something?" "I'm not running," I corrected her gently. "I'm just careful about who gets to write my story." The truth was, I wasn't afraid of being found. I was afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid that the carefully constructed identity of Leah Gray, the advocate, would be swallowed whole by the sensationalized story of Camille Serrano, the disgraced daughter. My work was my armor, and I wasn't ready to take it off. But life has a way of pulling you into the light, whether you're ready or not. My growing reputation in Denver led to an appointment by the governor to a state-level advisory board on immigration reform. The work was challenging and high-profile. After a particularly contentious public hearing where I successfully argued for the expansion of legal aid services, a journalist from a major Denver newspaper approached me. "Ms. Gray, that was an impressive display," he said. "We'd love to do a feature on you. A profile on a rising star in Colorado politics." My heart did a familiar, nervous flutter. A feature meant photos. It meant questions about my background, my education, my family. It meant visibility. Thank you, but I'm not interested in a personal profile, I said politely. But your story could be so inspiring, he insisted. Then let the work be the story, I replied and walked away. But the seed had been planted. I realized that to effect the kind of change I truly wanted, to move from advising to creating law, I couldn't remain in the shadows forever. The quiet influence I wielded had its limits. A few months later, I stood on the steps of the Colorado State Capitol, surrounded by a small but dedicated group of supporters from the Hearthstone Project and other community organizations. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. My voice, when I spoke into the microphones, was clear and steady, carrying over the hum of the city. I am not a politician, I began. I am a servant. And I have learned that service is not passive. It requires a willingness to step into the arena. That is why today I am announcing my candidacy for the Colorado State House of Representatives. There was a smattering of applause and the flash of a few cameras. My campaign materials were stark and simple. There were no smiling, airbrushed headshots, no saccharine stories about my childhood. Just my name, Leah Gray, and a simple, powerful slogan, justice, not politics. I didn't tell them I was the daughter of a judge. I didn't tell them I had once been cast out and left with nothing. I didn't offer them a story of redemption because I didn't feel I had anything to be redeemed from. I offered them only my work, my integrity, and my vision for a more just and compassionate state. I was stepping into the light, but on my own terms. I would be seen not for the family I had lost, but for the community I had fought to build. The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning, a digital whisper that quickly grew into a roar. Prominent Charleston attorney Genevieve Serrano investigated for fraud. My sister's name, a name I hadn't spoken or typed in 15 years, stared back at me from the screen. The article detailed allegations that she, now a senior partner at a prestigious firm, had knowingly submitted falsified financial documents to win a landmark corporate merger case. The fallout had ruined a smaller, family-owned business and its owners. It was a story of ambition curdling into corruption. My staff in the governor's office, for I had won that election, and then another, was a flurry of controlled panic. My chief of staff, Marcus, a man whose loyalty I trusted implicitly, closed my office door. "Governor," he said, his voice low. "The press is already making the connection. Sister of embattled attorney. We need a strategy." "There is no strategy," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "This is her story, not mine." But the world doesn't allow for such neat separations. The story wasn't just about Genevieve. It was about the Serrano name, about the legacy of our father, the unimpeachable Judge Serrano. And now it was about me, the forgotten daughter who had reappeared as the governor of a western state. The narrative was too juicy for the media to ignore. A few days later, the trial began. I didn't watch it on the news. I didn't read the articles. But I felt its pull, a strange, gravitational force tugging me back toward a life I had painstakingly escaped. Then, on an impulse I couldn't explain, I booked a commercial flight to Charleston under an assumed name. I told no one but Marcus. I entered the federal courthouse through a side entrance, wearing a simple black dress, a charcoal gray coat, and oversized sunglasses. I looked like a lawyer's aide, or perhaps a somber relative of the wronged party. I took a seat in the very last row, a space I knew well, the space of observers, of ghosts. The courtroom was a theater of hushed drama. Lawyers rustled papers. Journalists typed furiously into their laptops. In the front row, I saw my parents. My father, Arthur, sat ramrod straight, his face a granite mask of controlled fury. My mother, Eleanor, looked smaller than I remembered, fragile and lost, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. And at the defendant's table sat Genevieve. She was impeccable, as always, in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. She projected an aura of defiant confidence, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she lifted a glass of water to her lips. She was terrified. The presiding judge entered. Her name was Evelyn Reed, a formidable woman known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor. As she settled into her chair, her gaze swept the courtroom, a routine practice. Her eyes scanned the front rows, the press corps, and then moved to the back. They passed over me, then snapped back. A flicker of confusion, then recognition, dawned on her face. She paused, leaning forward slightly. "Hold on," she said, her voice cutting through the murmuring room. "Is that Governor Leah Gray?" A collective, silent gasp. Every head in the courtroom swiveled in my direction. The reporters near the front nearly tripped over themselves turning around. The soft click of a camera lens was followed by a blinding flash. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. My father's stoic mask crumbled, his eyes widening in disbelief as he stared at the daughter he had disowned. And Genevieve, her head whipped around, her carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. Her mouth fell open, her eyes locking onto mine with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a look that held 15 years of questions, of anger, of a dawning, horrifying understanding. I didn't move. I didn't smile or nod. I simply met her gaze, my expression calm, my presence a statement far louder than any words I could have spoken. I had not come to save her. I had not come to condemn her. I had come to bear witness. Judge Reed, recovering her composure, banged her gavel. "Order in this courtroom." The proceedings resumed, but the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The ghost had returned, not as a broken girl, but as a silent, seated power. I stayed until the court adjourned for the day, then rose and walked out the same way I had come in, a quiet storm leaving an unsettled silence in its wake. My past and present had finally collided, not in a fiery explosion, but in the cold, stark light of a federal courtroom. And everyone was watching. The courtroom reveal ignited a media firestorm. The narrative shifted overnight from Genevieve's fraud to my mysterious reappearance. The Serrano secret, Governor Gray's hidden past, one headline blared. From Charleston outcast to Colorado governor, the unbelievable story of Leah Gray, read another. My carefully constructed wall of privacy was demolished. And then, inevitably, someone unearthed it. The old video. Grainy, pixelated, but undeniably me at 22. It was recirculated on blogs and social media, framed as the scandal that started it all. The boy in the video, now a married father of 2, was tracked down and gave a self-serving interview, painting himself as a victim of youthful indiscretion. "I never meant for it to get out," he said with a practiced shrug. "We were just kids." My office was in chaos. "We have to issue a statement," my press secretary urged. "We can sue for defamation, invasion of privacy." "No," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "We do nothing. We say nothing. Let them look. I'm not ashamed. I had survived the shame once when I had nothing. I would certainly survive it now that I had built a life on my own terms." The first call came from my father. His voice was laced with the old, familiar tone of command, the one that expected absolute obedience. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, forgoing any greeting. "Dragging this family's name through the mud for a second time, all for a bit of public drama." I leaned back in my leather chair, the Denver skyline a panorama of steel and glass behind me. "The name is Serrano, Father," I said, my voice even. "I don't use it. You, however, seem to be having some trouble with it yourself." There was a stunned silence, then the sharp click of him hanging up. The next call was from a cousin in Charleston. My mother had collapsed. High blood pressure, a panic attack. She was in the hospital. Against my better judgment, a thread of old, buried obligation pulled at me. I took the red-eye flight, arriving at the hospital in the pre-dawn quiet. I found her in a private room, looking impossibly small and frail against the starched white sheets. The formidable Eleanor Serrano was gone, replaced by a tired, frightened old woman. Her eyes fluttered open as I entered. "Camille," she whispered, using my given name for the first time in a decade and a half. Her voice was thin, brittle. I stood by the window, my arms crossed, saying nothing. "Your father, he is beside himself," she murmured. "Genevieve, this trial," she started to cry, silent tears tracking paths through the fine wrinkles on her cheeks. "All these years, I prayed for you. I prayed you were safe. You prayed for me, but you didn't call me," I stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. She flinched. I didn't know how. Arthur forbade it. "You are a grown woman, Mother. You have always had a choice." Her tears flowed faster. "I chose my husband. I chose my family. You chose the family you thought was worth keeping," I finished for her, my voice gentle but unyielding. We sat in silence for a long time. Her quiet sobs, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Before I left, as she drifted into a medicated sleep, I placed a small, wrapped object on her bedside table. It was a framed print of the charcoal drawing I had made in my bleak Denver room all those years ago, the woman on the cliff edge, dissolving into the sky. A portrait of a ghost. I walked out without another word. Back in Denver, the pressure was immense. But I refused to hide. The next day, I held a scheduled press conference about a new water conservation initiative. The room was packed, not with environmental reporters, but with political journalists hungry for a soundbite about my family. Before taking questions, I stepped to the podium and looked directly into the cameras. I am aware of the speculation and stories circulating about my past and my family, I began, my voice clear and strong. I will not be commenting on the private legal matters of a private citizen. My past shaped me, but it does not define me. My focus, as it has always been, is on the people of Colorado. Now, who has a question about the future of our state's water? The room was silent for a beat, the reporters stunned by my refusal to play their game. Then, one by one, hands went up to ask about reservoirs and drought policy. I had drawn a boundary, not of silence, but of purpose. And in doing so, I had taken back control of the narrative. The verdict came down like a guillotine. Guilty. On all counts. Genevieve Serrano, the golden child, the brilliant legal mind, was a convicted felon. The sentence was handed down a week later, 5 years in a federal prison. The Serrano name, once a symbol of judicial integrity in Charleston, was now synonymous with disgrace. That night, my mother called. Her voice was a ragged whisper, stripped of all its former Southern gentility. Camille, she pleaded, the name now feeling foreign on her tongue. Please. You have to come home. Just for dinner. Your father, he wants to talk. A formal invitation to the home I was thrown out of. The irony was bitter. 15 years of silence, and now that their world was in ashes, they wanted to talk. Against all my instincts for self-preservation, a flicker of morbid curiosity made me say yes. I arrived at the buttercream house at dusk. It looked the same, but felt different, as if a shadow had fallen over it. Eleanor opened the door, her smile forced, her eyes red-rimmed. Arthur stood in the foyer, his posture rigid, but the formidable certainty was gone from his eyes. He looked like an old man. Dinner was a surreal performance of normalcy. My mother chattered nervously about the garden, the weather, anything to fill the suffocating silence. My father, in a startling departure from character, complimented my work in Colorado. Your policies on renewable energy are quite forward-thinking, he said, as if we were two colleagues at a civic luncheon. Genevieve was there, out on bail pending her appeal. She sat opposite me, a ghost of a different kind. She barely spoke, just pushed food around on her plate, her gaze fixed on the polished wood of the table. Finally, over a dessert no one touched, my father cleared his throat. Camille, he began, his tone measured, we find ourselves in a difficult position. I waited. Genevieve's appeal is a long shot, he continued. But a word from a sitting governor, a letter attesting to her character, a quiet call to the right people, it could make a difference. It could influence the parole board down the line. There it was. The reason for the dinner. The reason for the compliments. They didn't want their daughter back. They wanted a political asset. I placed my fork down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I looked from my father's expectant face to my mother's pleading eyes, to my sister's bowed head. Let me ask you a question, I said, my voice soft but piercing. If I were still Leah Gray, the woman who cleaned floors and lived in a rented room, would you have invited me to this dinner? If I had no power, no title, no influence to offer you, would I still be your daughter? The silence that followed was my answer. It was a deep, profound silence, filled with the weight of 15 years of abandonment. My mother's face crumpled. My father looked away, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Genevieve finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. No. I stood up, my napkin falling to the floor. The spell was broken. The old fear, the old need for their approval, had vanished. I felt nothing but a vast, quiet emptiness. I built my life not in spite of you, I said, my voice steady, but without you. I learned to be my own family, my own sanctuary. I cannot offer you a piece of that to fix what you broke. I turned and walked to the door. Camille, wait, My mother cried out, her voice cracking. But I didn't wait. I stepped out into the cool Charleston evening, leaving the ghosts of that house behind me for good. The air in my lungs felt cleaner, lighter. I wasn't running anymore. I was simply walking away, finally and completely free. The final act of the Serrano family drama didn't come with a bang, but with a series of quiet, desperate maneuvers. A week after the dinner, a vicious, anonymous blog post appeared, filled with distorted half-truths and private details from my early years in Denver, journal entries I had long since destroyed, photos I didn't know existed. It was a pathetic attempt to wound me, to paint me as unstable. I knew, with a cold certainty, that the source could only be my father, using his old connections to dig for leverage, to punish me for my refusal to play his game. Instead of retreating, I went on the offensive. But my weapon wasn't anger or retaliation, it was policy. The next morning, I stood before the Colorado State Legislature and introduced a new piece of legislation. For too long, we have talked about power in terms of corporations and governments, I began, my voice ringing with a conviction forged in fire. But sometimes, the most dangerous form of coercion comes from behind closed doors, from the very people who are supposed to be our staunchest allies. It comes in the form of emotional blackmail, of threats to one's reputation, of the weaponization of a shared past. I called it the Witness Protection and Integrity Act. It was a bill designed to create stronger legal protections for whistleblowers, witnesses, and public officials against intimidation, specifically naming familial and personal relationships as potential sources of undue influence. It was bold, it was personal, and it was a direct, legislative response to my family's tactics. I didn't have to name them. The world connected the dots. The bill made national news. I was lauded for my courage, for turning a personal attack into a universal shield for the vulnerable. The narrative had been irrevocably cemented. I was not the victim of my family. I was the survivor who fought back by trying to build a better, safer world. My father, my mother, my sister, they fell into a profound and lasting silence. They had no moves left to make. Months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, my assistant informed me that Genevieve was in the lobby. No appointment. Send her in, I said. She entered my office, no longer the impeccable attorney, but a woman humbled by circumstance. She was dressed in simple clothes, her face free of makeup, her hair cut short. She looked real. She didn't ask for anything. She simply stood before my desk and said, her voice quiet and hoarse, "I'm sorry, Camille. Not for what I did to my career. For what I did to you." I was so desperate for his approval, I was willing to sacrifice you to get it. I see that now. I looked at her, the sister who had been my first rival and my first betrayer. The anger I had held on to for so long had evaporated, leaving only a sad, distant pity. You didn't destroy me, Genevieve, I said. You just forced me to learn how to build something indestructible. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. I know. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth. I'm proud of you. I didn't reply. There was no hug, no easy forgiveness. There was only the quiet, somber acknowledgement of a truth that had taken a lifetime to be spoken. The door clicked shut, and I was alone again, but the silence in the room felt different. It felt like peace. The following winter, I found myself in a small community center in a working-class neighborhood of Denver. There was no press, no podium, just a circle of folding chairs and a group of young women, all survivors of difficult family situations, who had asked me to speak to them. I wore jeans and a soft, gray sweater. I spoke not as a governor, but as a fellow traveler. I told them about the shame, about the loneliness, about the slow, arduous process of building a sense of self-worth from scratch. We don't get to choose the family we are born into, I said, looking into their young, earnest faces. But we do get to choose what legacy we carry forward. We get to choose which stories we continue, and which ones we decide will end with us. As the women shared their own stories, I noticed a figure standing at the back of the room, near the door, half hidden in the shadows. It was my father. He wasn't wearing a suit or a judge's robe, just a simple coat. He looked older, frilier, and utterly alone. He just stood there, listening, for the entire 2 hours. When the event was over and people were beginning to leave, he walked slowly toward me. He didn't try to embrace me or offer a grand apology. He just stood a few feet away, his eyes meeting mine. They held no anger, no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness. "I never understood you," he said, his voice raspy. "I don't think I ever will." He took a breath. "But I see now that you built a life far more honorable than the one I demanded you live." He gave a short, stiff nod. "I see you, Camille." And then he turned and walked away. I didn't cry. I didn't call after him. I simply absorbed his words, a quiet, imperfect closure to a long and painful chapter. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was just an acknowledgement. A final, quiet surrender. I stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the city in a clean, white hush. I zipped up my coat and began the walk home, my footsteps the only sound on the quiet street. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I had once fought so hard to be seen. Now, in the quiet solitude of my own cell-made life, I finally understood that the only person whose sight truly mattered was my own. The journey to self-respect is often a quiet one, fought not on battlefields, but in the silent corridors of our own hearts. It's about learning to set boundaries, not as acts of war, but as acts of profound self-love. It's about realizing that you can honor where you came from without being imprisoned by it. Your story is yours to write, and its most beautiful chapters often begin on the very page where you expected it to end. If my story has resonated with you, I would be honored to hear your thoughts. Where are you on your own journey? Knowing these stories travel so far reminds me that none of us are truly alone. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please subscribe. There is always more to learn and more to share. Thank you for listening.